Hello and welcome to my History of Political Parties lecture. So by the end of this video, you will be able to identify and explain 5 party eras in American history and also explain the consequences of a divided government. So let's start with the founding, 1796 to 1824, and we've discussed this a bit in class already. But the first political parties that we had in the United States were the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. So we know that Alexander Hamilton led the Federalists, and that the Federalists favored a strong federal government and a national bank, and were supported by a coalition of commercial, financial, and manufacturing interests. On the other side of that, we had the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who supported a limited federal government and opposed the national bank. And they were supported by a coalition of farmers, shopkeepers, laborers, and planters. We've talked about this before, but a critical election in American history is the election of 1800, where we had John Adams, a Federalist, face off against Thomas Jefferson, a Democratic Republican, and Thomas Jefferson wins the election of 1800. So this marks the first time that a party in power peacefully gave up power after losing an election. And so this was a very big deal at the time, and that is why the election of 1800 is significant. Our second party era is the Jacksonians from 1828 to 1856. So we know that Andrew Jackson created the modern-day Democratic Party, and at this time, the party that opposed the Democrats were the Whigs, led by Henry Clay and Daniel Webster. So the Democrats support and usher in universal white male suffrage, and this begins a new era in American politics where political participation becomes a mass phenomenon. The party system of the Jacksonian era was one that was built from the bottom up rather than from the top down. And that was the previous way of doing things. Previously, caucuses made up of members of Congress would choose presidential electors. But under the Jacksonian era, we see that instead of members of Congress choosing presidential electors, we see that people start to vote in primaries for presidential electors. So by 1832, presidential electors were selected by a popular vote in virtually every state. Our third party era is the Republican era from 1860 to 1928. So you'll remember from American history that the issue of slavery dominated American politics during the 1850s. And what that issue does is it splits the Democrats and eventually leads to the demise of the Whig Party. So during this time, we see the Republican Party, led by Abraham Lincoln, emerge as the most dynamic anti-slavery party. So in this critical election of 1860, we see Abraham Lincoln win. And so we see that the Republican Party becomes the only party in American history to make this transition from a minor third party to a major party in one election. They're the only party to have ever done that. So the Democrats, however, do survive the Civil War. The Democratic Party does survive by becoming the dominant party in the South. And this becomes a fixture of American politics. The South is primarily Democrat for the next 100 years. Another critical election that we see during this time is the election of 1896, where we had William McKinley, who was a Republican, versus William Jennings Bryan, who was a Democrat. McKinley wins this election, and this essentially enables the Republican Party to remain America's majority party until the Great Depression. So with the Great Depression, we see an abrupt end to this era of Republican dominance with FDR's New Deal coalition. So these are the groups of people that were part of that coalition that supported FDR. And what is significant about this is that we see that urban dwellers and African Americans, which had been important parts of the Republican coalition previously, move into the Democratic Party. And this marks a significant party realignment that continues to the present day. And I talked about this last week. So we see as a result of this, with the exception of Dwight Eisenhower in the 1950s, that Democrats dominate the White House through the 1960s. So the last era that I want to talk to you about is this era of divided government, which we see 1968 to the present. The election of Richard Nixon in 1968 marked the beginning of a period of Republican dominance in presidential politics in this era of divided government. So you see here that we see, with the exception of Jimmy Carter, that Republicans dominate the White House until the early 1990s. One way that the Republicans were able to do this is under Nixon, they adopted a Southern strategy that was designed to break the Democrats' long dominance in the South. And so we saw this party realignment gradually occur as Southern conservatives transferred their loyalty to the Republican Party. And I called this the Great White Switch. So even by 2008, Republicans have held the majority of Southern House and Senate seats. So Nixon's election also marked the beginning of a new pattern of divided government. For when Richard Nixon was elected, it was the first time in the 20th century that a newly elected president moved into the White House while the opposition party controlled both houses of Congress. And so as a result, we see that from 1969 until 2010, the same party has controlled the presidency and both houses of Congress for just 12 years. So the pattern of divided government that we've seen since the late 1960s has had a number of important consequences. This first consequence is that it has heightened partisanship and made it difficult for moderates to negotiate compromises. The second consequence is that it has slowed both the confirmation and the legislative processes and created gridlock in Washington. And the third consequence as a result of those things is we've seen the public become frustrated with Washington, and we've seen a decline in trust and confidence in government, which has led to a decline in political efficacy. So another result of all of these things is that over the last half century, we've witnessed a decline in the percentage of voters who identify as Democrats or Republicans, and we've seen a rise in independents. So as a result, there's been an increase of split ticket voters who support candidates of different parties on the same ballot. And this has led to something that we call party de-alignment. That's the process of disengagement of people from political parties. So they've become frustrated with political parties in Washington. They disengage from them. That's party de-alignment, and we see more and more voters identifying as independents. All right, that's all I have for you today. Thank you for listening.